Hello everyone and welcome back. In this video, we're going to learn how to use Pytest with a Flask app. So let's get started. So first we'll start off with our requirements.txt file, and this will have all the dependencies we need for our application. Then we have a pytest.ini file, and this just specifies the test path for our test and any additional options we want for Pytest. Then we have a .env file, and this will be all the environment variables we need for our application. You can see we have a database URL pointing to a dev.db SQLite file, and a test database URL pointing to a test.db SQLite file. Then we'll take a look into our app folder, and this is a very basic setup for a Flask app. We'll start by taking a look into the settings.py file, and in here we have a class of settings with all of our environment variables that we need, and we are loading this in with loadenv from python.env. Then we'll take a look at our routes.py file, and this one is using a blueprint to help separate out our routes to specific endpoints. So here we have a blueprint called users, and we are giving it the URL prefix of /users. So we do a user blueprint.post. So this will be in /users/create, and this will go ahead and create a new user. Then we have our models.py file, which just sets up SQLalchemy. For the setup, I am using Flask SQLalchemy. Then we have our CLI.py file, and this will be some CLI commands we can use using the Flask CLI command, and this is used in combination with click. We have a register commands function here that takes in a Flask app, and we'll go ahead and register the commands to that specific app. So this will allow us to switch between a test app and a real app and make it easy to add these commands. Then in a dunder init file right here, we have our Flask setup. We have our create app function that has a parameter of testing. We would say that if we pass in specifically testing for this create app, or our settings.testing is equal to true. So back in our settings file, we have getting the environment variable of testing. If it doesn't exist, it's just false, equal to true. We will go ahead and set the apps config of SQLalchemy database URL to this test database URL, and we'll make sure that testing is true for this. If not, we'll just use the regular database URL. We set the secret key, and we'll go and turn off this so the database operations aren't logged to the console. We go and initialize our database, register any CLI commands, and then register the blueprint for that user's endpoint and return the app. If we pull up the terminal, we'll go ahead and create an env file and switch over to it. And we will go ahead and activate this virtual environment, and we'll do a pip install -r requirements.txt file. Collected everything, we'll go ahead and clear the console, and we can then do flask run, and we can see our application is running. And in doing this, there is no database created under this instance folder. If we do exit out of this and we type flask and press enter, we can see that there's a bunch of options, but it also lists our CLI commands here. So we can see there's two CLI commands that we added here. So we do flask create.db. We went ahead and create our database, and we can see in this instance folder, it created the dev.db file. I'm going to go ahead and delete this since we're not going to go any farther with that. We'll go ahead and look into the Pytest tests and be sure that they don't interact with our dev.db file. In this test file, we have the dunder init, so that way we can access the app folder here, and this is empty. Then we have our conf test file, and this is very similar to past videos we've gone over so far. But here in our first fixture, we just have an app fixture for the entire session, where we are creating the app and making sure that this testing parameter is true. We go and get an app context. That way we can perform the database operations associated with our application, create the database, return this application, and drop the database at the end of the session. Then we have our client fixture, and this will allow us to test the routes for our application. So it just returns a test client. Then we have our database session here with the fixture of app being passed in. And we're getting a connection to our database, setting up transaction, creating the test session that we need and assigning it to the DB. Then we are yielding this test session and then rolling back any changes that happen, removing the session and closing the connection. Then the last fixture we set up is the runner for our Flask application. This allows us to test the CLI commands to be sure that they work the way that we want it to. And this just returns a Flask CLI runner with app.test CLI runner. So we'll take a look at our test CLI.py file, and here we've got a couple tests. Here we're testing that our user is being created by the CLI command, giving the parameter of runner and DB session. We can then run our CLI commands by doing runner.invoke, passing in the arguments that you would pass in the command line. So this is the equivalent of in the command line typing flask add user Bob. And we'll make sure that our exit code for this command was 0, so it succeeded. And we make sure that the user Bob was added in the result. Since if we take a look back at our app CLI folder, when we create a user, it echoes out user was added. Then to be sure that's actually added into our database, We go and perform a query on the database, getting the user with the name Bob and asserting that they're not none. Then we do it the same thing here, but with a parameterized set of users to add, and it performs the same operation. Now we'll take a look at our testusers.py file, and here we're testing our user's endpoint, passing in that client as the Flask client and the DB session. First, we will make sure there are no users in our database. Then we will perform a post request on this user/create, passing in this JSON value, and make sure that our request was successful, and get the data from our response. Then we make sure that the name in the response matches the name that we passed in. And then we check to be sure that our database has this new user. Then we have another test of test no users, and this will just test that there's no users in our database. It's kind of a pointless test, but this is just to show that the users created from this test do not carry over into this test. So we can go and pull up the terminal, and we'll type Pytest, and we can see all of our tests had passed. So super cool. And we can see over here on the right side for this instance folder, it only created the test.db file, so we can be sure that the way we have it set up for these Pytests, it's not going to interact with a different kind of database. All you need to be sure that Pytest will work seamlessly with your Flask application is a way to indicate for your create app that it is testing, to get a test database URL, and get the actual DB from your application to interact with your database. And that's it. That's how you can set up Pytest with Flask. If you found this video helpful, leave a thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.